The bridal suite smelled like expensive lilies in the bitter herbal steam of Madame Sujin's tea. Avery Bennett sat just inches away from a woman with the most haunted eyes she'd ever seen, watching her future mother-in-law's hands tremble as they gripped Avery's own, a grip that felt way too desperate for a day of celebration. Avery had been trying to find the right words to thank her for the last 10 minutes, while the distant sound of the wedding orchestra tuning their instruments echoed through the heavy oak doors. Outside, there was a world of silk, champagne, and a man waiting at the altar who promised her forever. Again, another lavish gesture, more gifts that felt like a dream, and more socialites saying she was the luckiest woman in the city to have captured the heart of a tycoon like Tae-sung. But as Madame Sujin leaned in, her voice a jagged whisper against Avery's ear, Avery realized the dream was actually a carefully constructed cage. The older woman wasn't there to offer a blessing, she was there to offer an escape. Now Avery knew who she was really marrying. She just didn't know how she was going to survive the next 60 minutes. The light in the grand hall of the Singapore Business Summit had been gold, honeyed, artificial, and blinding. It was there, amidst the hum of high-stakes networking and the scent of expensive cologne, that Avery Bennett first felt the weight of Jang Tae-sung's attention. She had just finished her presentation on sustainable infrastructure in emerging markets, her voice steady and her data unimpeachable, when she stepped off the stage and found him waiting in the wings. He didn't approach her like the other investors, with a hungry eye for profit. He approached her with the quiet, focused reverence of a man who had finally found something he couldn't buy. "Your analysis of the logistical bottleneck in sub-Saharan trade was brilliant, Miss Bennett," he had said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. "Most people here see numbers. You see the people behind them." He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been carved onto his frame, his dark hair swept back with surgical precision. But it was his eyes that trapped her, intelligent, disciplined, and seemingly filled with an honest curiosity. For the next 3 days, his pursuit was a masterclass in intentionality. He didn't just send flowers, he sent first-edition copies of the book she had mentioned in passing. He didn't just invite her to dinner, he rented out an entire rooftop garden so they could discuss the future of global trade without the noise of the world intruding. In those moments, Tae-sung was the embodiment of the pure tycoon. He spoke of legacy, of building a world his mother could be proud of, and of the heavy responsibility of wealth. He listened to Avery with a devastating focus, making her feel like the only person in a city of millions. He shared stories of his own rise, of the long nights and the sacrifices he had made to transform his family's modest holdings into a global empire. He never mentioned the shadows. He never spoke of the ghost. Avery had prided herself on her ability to read people, to spot a flaw in a contract or a lie in a pitch. But with Tae-sung, every piece of data she collected pointed toward a man of rare integrity and profound strength. When he finally proposed on a private balcony overlooking the Han River months later, his voice trembling just enough to feel real, Avery hadn't seen a predator, she had seen a partner. She had fallen for the mask, not because it was beautiful, but because Tae-sung had worn it with the absolute conviction of a man who desperately wanted it to be his true face. She had walked into his world with her eyes wide open, never realizing that the man she loved was merely a brilliant performance. The scent of lilies in the bridal suite suddenly turned cloying, like the perfume of a funeral parlor. Madame Sujin's grip on Avery's hands tightened, her knuckles white and skeletal. "The man you love doesn't exist, Avery," the older woman whispered, her voice trembling with a grief that had been decades in the making. "The billionaire, the philanthropist, the visionary, that is the suit he wears to walk in the light, but in the dark, he is the ghost, and the ghost does not have a soul." Sujin began to speak of a different Taesung, a man who had built his empire not on infrastructure, but on the silent, systematic dismantling of anyone who stood in his way. She spoke of the night 10 years ago when a rival syndicate had crossed a line, and how the ghost had vanished an entire family before dawn, leaving no trace, no evidence, only a terrifying silence that secured his seat at the table. She described the systematic way he moved through the city's veins, controlling the ports, the shadowed alleys, and the very men who were supposed to uphold the law. He earned that name because you never see him coming. He is a master of the invisible strike. He doesn't forgive. He doesn't show mercy. He once sat at a dinner table with a man who had stolen from him, laughed with the man's children, and then gave the order for the house to be leveled 5 minutes after he walked out. He treats the underworld like a game of chess, and every piece on the board is expendable. Avery felt the air leave her lungs. The ghost was a legend in the city, a phantom blamed for the most ruthless power shifts in the criminal world. To hear that the man who'd tucked a stray hair behind her ear and promised her a life of peace was the same man responsible for such cold-blooded efficiency was a betrayal that felt physical. "I loved his father, and I watched the darkness swallow him whole," Sujin said, a single tear tracing a path through the lines on her face. "I see the way Taesung looks at you. He wants to be good for you. He wants to believe he can keep the ghost in a box and only show you the man. But blood calls to blood. Avery, you're real. You're respectful and intelligent. You don't belong in a world of ghosts. Run before the shadow he casts becomes your only reality." The heavy oak doors of the groom suite creaked open, emitting a draft of cold air that stirred the white silk of Avery's train. Inside, the room was a sanctuary of masculine luxury: polished wood, the scent of expensive bourbon, and the low hum of a television flickering with stock market updates. Taesung stood by the window, his back to her, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo with the same rhythmic, surgical precision she had admired at the summit. He looked every bit the titan of industry, a man whose hands were built for building empires, not burying them. "The ceremony starts in 15 minutes, Avery," he said, his voice warm and steady, not yet turning to face her. "You're breaking tradition. It's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the altar." Avery didn't answer immediately. She stood in the center of the room, her silhouette framed by the froth of her wedding gown, looking like a ghost herself against the dark velvet curtains. She felt a strange, detached clarity. The trembling in her hands had stopped, replaced by a cold, entrepreneurial focus. She wasn't just a bride, she was an investigator who had finally found the missing variable in a lethal equation. Taesung turned, a smile beginning to form on his lips, a smile that died the moment he saw her face. The serious, focused gaze she usually reserved for boardrooms was now fixed on him with the intensity of a spotlight. "Taesung," she started, her voice a low melodic blade that cut through the quiet of the room. "I've spent the last hour learning about a man I've never met, a man who moves through this city like a shadow, a man who doesn't leave witnesses and doesn't show mercy." Taesung's expression didn't shatter, it simply hardened, the warmth in his eyes retreating into a dark, impenetrable depth. He didn't move, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, the air becoming heavy with a sudden, predatory tension. Avery took a single step forward, the silk of her dress rustling like a warning. "I was told that the man I'm marrying is a mask," she whispered, "that beneath the tycoon is someone they call the ghost, someone feared by every syndicate and respected by every monster in the underworld." She stopped just a few feet from him, maintaining the fierce, unblinking eye contact that had once intimidated her business rivals. "I need to know before I take another step toward that altar. I need to know the truth of the man standing in front of me." Her voice remained steady, devoid of the hysterics he might have expected. "Is there a ghost in this room, Taesung? Or are you finally going to show me your real face?" The silence that followed was absolute. Taesung looked at her, and for the first time, the pure tycoon was gone. In his place was something older, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The silence in the room didn't break, it curdled. For a moment, Taesung stood perfectly still, a statue carved from shadows and expensive wool. Then, the mask didn't just slip, it dissolved. The soft, attentive light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a gaze so cold and calculating, it made the warm bridal suite feel like a meat locker. He didn't flinch or offer a frantic denial. Instead, he slowly reached up and loosened his silk tie, his movements fluid and devoid of the tycoon's polished warmth. My mother has always had a soft heart for beautiful things. She thought she was saving you. What she didn't realize is that she was merely showing you the foundation of the house you were about to inhabit. He took a step toward her, and for the first time, Avery felt the instinctive urge to recoil. This was the man who moved through the city's veins like a virus. There was a predatory grace in his stride, a terrifying lack of wasted motion. He stopped just inches away, his shadow eclipsing the white lace of her bodice. I am the ghost, Avery. I have done things that would make your blood turn to ice, just to ensure that you could walk through this world without ever having to look over your shoulder. He didn't look ashamed. He looked like a man explaining the weather. The summit, the dinners, the books, they weren't just a performance. They were the only parts of me that were allowed to be human. I built a wall around my life so high that the blood couldn't seep through, all so I could have one thing that was pure. That one thing was you. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, and though she was terrified, she saw the slight tremor in his fingers. It was the only crack in the ghost's armor. Every contract I signed in the light was for the company, but every life I took in the dark was to protect the world I was building for us, he whispered, his eyes dark with a desperate, jagged honesty. I lied about my name, my work, and my past, but I never lied about how I felt when I looked at you. That was the only truth I had left. The tycoon is a lie, the ghost is a necessity, but the man who loves you, he's the only one currently fighting for air. He looked at her then, not as a boss or a predator, but as a man standing on the edge of a precipice. He had admitted to being a monster, but he was a monster who was utterly and hopelessly at her mercy. The air in the room remained thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of the truth. Avery stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the man who had just admitted to being a phantom of the underworld. She didn't look at him with the horror he might have expected, but with the cold, calculating precision of a woman who knew that every crisis was simply a negotiation in disguise. She saw the tremor in his hands, the only fraying thread in his perfect armor, and she knew she had her leverage. I'm not a child to be protected, Taesung, and I'm not a trophy to be kept in a gilded cage while you stain the world outside. You say you love me, then you have to choose, because I will not be the wife of a ghost. Taesung's jaw tightened, the lines of his face hardening into the mask of the syndicate leader once more. It isn't that simple, Avery. You don't just walk away from this life. The shadows don't let go. Then you make them let go, Avery countered, stepping even closer until the white silk of her bodice brushed against his charcoal suit. I am a businesswoman. I deal in assets, liabilities, and long-term growth. Right now, your underworld profile is a liability that will eventually bankrupt us both. If you want me to walk down that aisle, if you want a life that is actually real, then we do this my way. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a document she had drafted in the frantic minutes after Madame Sujin's confession. This is an ultimatum. You have exactly 12 months to liquidate every illegal asset, sever every tie to the syndicates, and transition the Jane Group into a 100% legitimate entity. No more shadows, no more ghosts, no more blood. Taesung looked at the paper, then back at her, his eyes searching hers for a hint of a bluff. He found only the steel of a woman who was prepared to walk away from the wedding of the century if her terms weren't met. If I sign this, Avery, I become a target, he whispered, his voice stripped of his usual confidence. Without the ghost, I am just a man, and a man can be killed. And with me, you are a partner, Avery said, her voice softening just enough to remind him of the woman he had courted. I have the strategy to move the money where they can't find it. I have the intellect to build a front they can't break. I will be your shield, Taesung, but only if you agree to step into the light. The clock on the mantel ticked toward the hour. Taesung stared at the pen in his hand, then at the woman who was offering him a salvation he hadn't believed possible. With a sharp, decisive stroke, he signed his name, not as the ghost, but as the man who wanted to be worthy of her. The doors to the cathedral swung open and the swell of the pipe organ washed over Avery like a tidal wave. To the hundreds of guests seated in the pews, the diplomats, the celebrities, and the titans of industry, the sight was the pinnacle of a modern fairy tale. Avery moved down the aisle, a vision in white silk and lace, her face a mask of serene, bridal bliss. Beside her, the flashes of 100 cameras captured the image of the year, the brilliant American entrepreneur marrying the untouchable king of the Jane Group. But beneath the veil, Avery's heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. She kept her eyes fixed on Taesung, who stood at the altar waiting for her. He looked magnificent, every inch the noble husband. Yet as she reached him and he took her hand, she felt the slight electric tension in his grip. It was a secret language, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer just a couple, they were co-conspirators. As the priest began the liturgy, the words about love, honor, and cherishing took on a jagged double meaning. When they spoke their vows, promising to protect one another in sickness and in health, they weren't just reciting tradition, they were signing a pact of survival. Every I do was a declaration of war against the shadows that loomed just outside the cathedral's stained glass windows. Avery looked into Taesung's dark eyes and saw the ghost looking back, but it was a ghost in retreat, a phantom that had agreed to be exorcised by the woman holding his hand. In the front row, Madame Sujin watched them, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She saw the way Avery stood, not as a submissive bride, but as a strategic partner. The older woman recognized the steel in her posture, the way she didn't just lean on Taesung, but anchored him. The ceremony concluded with a kiss that the tabloids would call breathtaking, but for Avery, it tasted like salt and iron. As they turned to walk back down the aisle as husband and wife, the applause was deafening. To the world, the Jang Empire had just become stronger, more legitimate, and more beautiful. Only Avery and Taesung knew the truth. The ghost was dead, and the man who replaced him had just given his wife the keys to a kingdom of secrets. As they stepped out into the blinding sunlight and the cheering crowds, the real work began. The year of liquidation had started, and in the underworld, silence was the only thing more dangerous than a confession. The transition from the cathedral to the boardroom was a descent from the ethereal into a cold, clinical war zone. Inside the inner sanctum of the Jane Group, the air was thick with a new kind of silence, one that wasn't respectful but suspicious. Taesung sat at the head of the mahogany table, his expression an impenetrable mask of granite, but his lieutenants could feel the shift. The ghost was no longer calling for blood, he was calling for balance sheets. "We are diversifying," Taesung announced, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that broke no interruption. The logistics arms, the shipping lanes, the private security sectors, everything is being folded into a transparent holding company. Within 12 months, our books will be clean enough to pass a federal audit. Across the table, the men who had built the underworld empire exchanged glances that were sharp as razors. They were men of the shadow, and to them, legitimacy was a death sentence. They saw the wedding not as a union, but a domesticating cage. To them, the ghost wasn't evolving, he was going soft. But they hadn't accounted for Avery. She stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline, dressed in a power suit that fit like armor. She didn't look like a mob wife, she looked like a predator who had traded a blade for a ledger. When the head lieutenant, a man whose hands were stained with a decade of enforcement, began to protest, Avery didn't let him finish. "You think clean means weak, Mr. Park. I'm here to show you that the sun provides much better visibility for growth." She began to detail a complex infrastructure of shell companies, reinvestment strategies, and legitimate tech acquisitions that would move their capital through a labyrinth of global markets. It was an entrepreneurial brilliance so sophisticated that even the most seasoned criminal mind couldn't find a crack. She was creating a front that wasn't just a mask, it was a fortress. By the time she finished, the lieutenants realized that Avery wasn't just Taesung's wife. She was the new architect of their reality. The resistance was there, simmering beneath the surface, but Avery had effectively neutralized their immediate moves. She had turned their illegal empire into a machine that was too profitable to dismantle, yet too public to keep dirty. As the meeting adjourned, the lieutenants filed out with a heavy sense of unease. They knew the ghost was still there, but he now had a partner who knew how to turn his darkness into a currency the world actually respected. The war for the soul of the Jane Group had begun, and Avery had just fired the first brilliant shot. The fragile piece of the transition shattered on a rain-slicked Tuesday evening, just as the city lights began to bleed into the asphalt. They were leaving a charity gala, one of the many legitimate milestones Avery had curated to cement their new public image, when the atmosphere shifted. Taesung felt it first, that primal, cold prickle at the base of his neck that had kept him alive in the shadows for a decade. The valet was too slow, the street too quiet, and the black sedan idling at the corner had windows that were a shade too dark. "Stay behind me, Avery," he whispered, his voice dropping into that low, lethal register she had come to recognize as the ghost. He didn't reach for a weapon, his entire body became one. The strike came from the Dragon Circle, a rival syndicate that saw Taesung's move toward legitimacy as a sense of blood in the water. 3 men emerged from the shadows of the parking structure, the suppressed cough of a handgun echoing against the concrete. Taesung moved with a blurred, terrifying efficiency, pulling Avery behind the reinforced pillar of the garage. But Avery didn't cower. While Taesung monitored the perimeter with the focus of a predator, she pulled her phone from her clutch. She didn't call the police, they were too far and likely paid for. She accessed the private security grid she had spent months building, a network of encrypted drones and localized frequency jammers she had hidden under the guise of estate maintenance. "Taesung, 30 degrees to your left, behind the silver SUV," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor amidst the chaos. "I've jammed their comms. They can't coordinate, and I've just triggered the fire suppression system in the north wing. It'll create a whiteout of mist. Move now." It was a symphony of violence and intellect. Taesung provided the raw physical force, disarming the first assailant with a strike so fast it was nearly invisible, while Avery provided the tactical oversight. She navigated him through the blind spots of their attackers, using the building's own smart systems to trap the remaining 2 gunmen in a stairwell lockout. When the mist cleared, the attackers were neutralized, pinned by the automated security detail Avery had summoned with a single tap on her screen. Taesung stood over the last man, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, controlled heave. He looked at Avery, who was adjusting her necklace, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fierce, brilliant light. For the first time, the ghost realized that he hadn't just married a woman to protect, he had married the only person capable of keeping him alive in a world that never forgot a debt. They weren't just a tycoon and his bride, they were a fortress. The transition was complete, not with a roar of gunfire, but with the quiet, authoritative scrape of a fountain pen across a final set of divestment papers. In the private study of their estate, Taesung sat before a stack of documents that represented the systematic dismantling of a shadow empire. As he signed a last page, he felt a weight lift that he hadn't realized he was carrying, a phantom limb of the ghost finally falling away. He looked up at Avery, who stood by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames reflecting in her calm, triumphant eyes. She wasn't just his wife, she was the architect of his redemption. Months later, the grand ballroom of the Seoul Metropolitan Arts Center was a sea of light, silk, and the polite clinking of crystal. This gala wasn't a front or a strategic necessity. It was a celebration of the Jane Group's first fully transparent fiscal year. Taesung moved through the crowd with a new kind of grace. The predatory stillness was gone, replaced by the relaxed confidence of a man who no longer had anything to hide. He spoke of innovation and philanthropy, and for the first time, the words didn't feel like a script. Avery stood by his side, resplendent in a gown of shimmering gold that complemented the mahogany of her skin.
She navigated the social waters with the same brilliance she had navigated the underworld, turning skeptics into allies and rivals into partners. When Taesung caught her eye, there was a shared secret in the look, a silent reminder of the war they had fought in the dark so they could stand together in the light. High above the ballroom floor, on the shadowed curve of the mezzanine balcony, Madame Sujin watched them. She leaned against the marble railing, her teal silken sleeves catching the upward glow of the chandeliers. A year ago, she had stood in a bridal suite and begged a stranger to run for her life. She had seen her son as a lost cause, a man consumed by a legacy of blood that she thought was inescapable. As she watched Taesung lean in to whisper something to Avery, causing her to break into a bright, genuine laugh, Sujin felt a peace she hadn't known in decades. Her son hadn't just been saved, he had been transformed. The woman she had tried to warn turned out to be the only person strong enough to stay. Avery hadn't run from the fire. She had walked into it and shaped it into something beautiful.
Sujin took a slow, deep breath, the scent of expensive lilies no longer smelling like a funeral, but like a beginning. The ghost was a memory, a name whispered in stories that no longer had a place in this room. Down below, the king and his queen turned to lead the first dance, stepping perfectly in sync, two halves of a whole, finally and truly out of the shadows. True love is not just a feeling of safety, but a partnership of transformation that requires the courage to face the truth, no matter how dark it may be. This story teaches us that we shouldn't be defined by our past mistakes or the shadows we've lived in, provided we are willing to step into the light and do the hard work of change. It reminds viewers that the strongest relationships are built when two people refuse to settle for a comfortable lie and instead challenge each other to be better versions of themselves. Just as Avery saw the man beneath the monster, and Taesung chose a legacy of integrity over a kingdom of fear, we must realize that our greatest power lies in choosing who we become tomorrow rather than being held captive by who we were yesterday. Accountability and loyalty are the true foundations of a lasting empire. Thanks for watching. Check out the video at the upper right of the screen.